When a podcast manages to get to 500 episodes, there are many ways to celebrate. You can toast. Let's do that.
Cheers!
Oh, that was probably a little hard on the mic. You can exchange gifts. You can just bask. Or you can plow ahead with preparations for the next one, because doing a weekly show is a wheel that never stops turning.
Wait. How come I'm not getting gifts?
It's the gift of a good podcast. I guess we'll do a little of all of that. But an important spoke on that wheel is our longtime sponsor, Sparkplug Coffee. Sparkplug offers their customers the freshest beans in Canada, which just so happen to be fairly traded premium Arabica beans. If you like decaf or half calf, you can load up on those too. They've also got an assortment of blends and roasts, including a series of seasonal blends, in case you're one of those people who gets tired of drinking the exact same thing. Sparkplug delivers to the United States and Canada within a week of receiving your order, and they'll even ship your stuff free if you live in Canada. But they suggest you become a member of the Autopilot Coffee Club. That way you'll save money on every order, plus membership gets you perks and deals that the once-in-a-while orderers do not get. You can even customize your membership to get your orders when you truly need them. Thus, this is not a silly Coffee of the Month club. So crack those knuckles, and once you're limbered up, type out sparkplug.coffee/HYES in your device to get a 20% savings off your next order. That HYES promo code gives Have You Ever Seen a little bit of the moolah. So you get something great, and we get a little taste too. Now, if you please, Andrew Luther, strike up your one-man band and play us into this landmark episode.
And action! Have you ever seen?
Hello, one and all, and we thank you ever so much for being part of the audience for episode number 500. We just toasted in the intro, the coffee sponsor. Let's do it again.
Cheers, cheers!
Not quite over the mic this time. This is a big moment for any podcast. I didn't drink the water. Oh my God.
Bad luck.
I'm cursing it.
Curse our next 500 episodes.
You're not supposed to toast with water in the first place, apparently, but that's all I got. This is a big moment for any podcast, and it took us almost exactly 10 years to get here. Yep, our podcast's 10-year anniversary is only a few days away, too. So we review classic movies and we spoil them, although today we'll be talking about a whole slew of great films as we highlight the best pictures. The greatest best pictures. I like calling it the best pictures, though. I am Ryan Ellis, and here's my delightful wife and, of course, co-host, Bev.
That's me.
So, the best pictures. To avoid us covering the same movie, what we did was each pull the names of 10 films out of our vintage popcorn box right here. You can't see it, but I can, and Bev can. That means that a few truly great winners of the top Oscar might not even be mentioned today, or at least not extensively like we're about to. Well, we're going to dig into the box at the end of this and see what didn't get picked. We don't know what's in there. Also, I can't speak for Bev's 10, but all of mine won both Best Picture and Best Director, so there were no picture-director splits. Generally, I don't like when the voters do that. If you directed the best movie of the year, you were probably the best director, too. Also, we previously reviewed every single one of these 20 we're about to praise, so scroll back in our archives to hear what we said about them. Some of them are a long way back. And if those reviews don't match up entirely with the lavish praise you're about to hear, well, times change and people change. I just know that now, in 2023, this is how I feel about these films, and I'm sure Bev is the same, right?
Yeah, I actually went back and looked at some of my notes from old reviews and was kind of alarmed to find that the sentiments I feel about some of these films are not what I felt. One of them in particular, almost 10 years ago, that I've grown to love quite a bit more in the last 10 years.
Okay. And after all the gushing we're about to do, we're going to highlight, well, lowlight, the worst snubs in the history of the Best Picture Oscar. The movie we'll mention was at least nominated for Best Picture, the one we wanted to win, but something inferior won. So that'll come after the 10 we each love. But before we get into any of that, let's do the coming attractions trivia. Which Best Picture winner have you seen the most often?
It's probably The Godfather.
Good choice. For me, it's probably Forrest Gump, although One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Casablanca are way up there. Godfather is too. I think I've seen each of my 10 at least 4 times each, though, so I've got a great sample of all these movies, and some of them, of course, we're talking maybe something like 10 times. Cuckoo's Nest is one of those movies I've seen, and even Forrest Gump, in part, you'll see maybe 25, 30 minutes of it on TV. Doesn't count as a full viewing, so it feels like I've seen some of these movies even more than I probably really have.
Yeah, Godfather and Forrest Gump, for that matter, are one of those movies that if you happen to catch it on TV, you're just watching it from wherever it starts.
So I'll go first with my 10 best pictures. I'll do my number 10, then Bev will do her number 10, then my number 9, then her number 9, and so on. Number 10 for me is The Sting, which hit theaters on Christmas Day, 1973, and I believe The Exorcist hit theaters the same day, and it was up against it for a lot of the big awards. The Sting won 7 Oscars a few months later, and it has remained beloved enough that I was a little surprised it didn't make the AFI's Top 100 list in either 1998 or 2007, or even both. It's one of the most fun of my tensum, even if there are some dark and even disturbing scenes in it. Any movie that reunites Paul Newman and Robert Redford, those great friends who had chemistry galore, is on its way to being something special, and two of your favorites when it comes to fellows.
Oh yeah, they're my classic heartthrobs, those
And
two.
at this point, they were still in their physical prime. Not that
Yes,
they looked bad even 20 years later. So Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid remains one of my favorite westerns and favorite comedies that also starred the two of them, and George Roy Hill directed that just like he did The Sting. So these three guys hit home runs when they decided to pull up their period-appropriate sleeves and make a movie together. David Ward's script is terrific, but it was the big twist that was game-changing at the time, and it sure got me the first time I saw the film. And what really helps make The Sting stand out is that playing off Paul and Bob is an underrated villain in Robert Shaw. Quint in Jaws is an even better role, okay, but he practically steals this movie with all that menace. Lonergan. You wouldn't want to fuck with this guy unless the whole point is to fuck over this guy, which it is. Newman and Redford never worked together again, and that's a shame, but it's a downer that Shaw didn't work with either of them again either. Although Shaw did live too much longer past this. It was maybe 4 years later he died. And then there's the ragtime music, which isn't even accurate to when the movie is set. Of course, the bouncy fun of da 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 doesn't always jibe with Luther's death early on or all the violence at the end, including the fake violence at the very end. But that music is still as iconic as anything else from this motion picture. Although one last thing about The Sting, and it's a theme I'll come back to today, there's an underlying sadness to this, which I like. Redford is driven to get revenge against Shaw for killing his friend, while Newman is a drunk when we first see him, just an absolute fall-down drunk. At the end, they walk off together, seemingly triumphant, but what do they do now? Is Newman going to end up wasted and badly hungover every day again after this? Is Redford going to turn into Batman because getting revenge isn't enough? You want more? And because I asked those what happens next type questions, like we usually do in a normal podcast, we'll ignore the fact that there was a crappy sequel.
Consider it ignored. When we were picking our 10 movies from the popcorn box, we were allowed to have a couple of trades, and I originally picked The Sting. I had to give it to you. 1, because I knew you loved it. 2, because I just don't have that much nice to say about it.
You didn't dislike it, did you?
I didn't dislike it. It's fine. There's lots to like about it. The twist, I don't know, maybe because I've seen all of the movies that have poorly copied it. The premise I find impossible to believe, like it's just too over the top. But it's more guilty of being mimicked poorly than it is of being a poorly written script.
Sure.
I bet it was very exciting and fun at the time, but I've just never been able to find love for it.
Or even the first time I would have seen it, which was probably the early 90s, when it wasn't done quite so often, these twists you're talking about.
Pre-Ocean's 11, when I think...
Or Shyamalan's movies.
Oh, yeah.
Usual Suspects.
Those are great twist movies. Yeah, Usual Suspects is
Fight
probably
Club.
the worst. I mean, like those elaborate twists where you have to believe that your heroes are capable of godlike powers of control over their environment. But as you said, looking at those two men for 2 hours is fine by me.
In those costumes.
So my number 10, Dances with Wolves, which is a film I absolutely love, but I have a hard time defending against the people who can criticize it, because I think that they are right. My love for it comes from just loving the cinematography, the landscape, my unexplainable affinity for Kevin Costner. When
I like him too.
When he's at his most Kevin Costner, he's not a man that's ever really tried that hard to stretch beyond his comfort zone, and this movie is right in his comfort zone. I could just watch him read the phone book or stare into the horizon for all the time that he does in
That
this
you do.
movie. Which you do.
The phone book, no. The staring, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Love Graham Greene in this movie, Canadian actor.
Mary McDonnell.
Mary McDonnell is great. It's a little too long. It's also aging poorly with that really white savior-y narrative.
Yeah.
Probably the biggest crime the film ever committed was that it beat Goodfellas.
This will come up later.
For the Oscar. A miscarriage of justice, if there ever was one. So, on this esteemed list, with no losers, it comes in last. And maybe that's the biggest reason why.
That was my feeling about The Sting, too. I had to put something number 10. I like it a lot, but it's definitely my least of the 10. I think Dances would probably be the same for me, too.
How much did you struggle to get the order?
Not that much.
I had to just go with my first instinct, because I knew if I overthought it, I would never be able to start.
If we started over with the same movies tomorrow, put them back in the box, and then pull them all over again, and I forgot what I did here, I would probably reorder them, because that's what always happens with top 10 lists.
I know, it's funny that we
For me, anyway.
have a podcast that started on the premise
Of a list?
ranking movies, a thing that I find eye-rollingly impossible to do. And it's funny, like you said
We're doing
earlier.
it 500 in.
We're doing it 500 in, and disagreeing with how I felt about some of these movies when we originally covered them.
I find that fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Hit me up with your number 9.
That's No Country for Old Men, which was released in the fall of 2007. It won 4 Oscars, including 3 each for Joel and Ethan Coen, so they have 4 Oscars because they won for writing Fargo. I remember saying when we covered this movie in 2016 that before I had even seen it, I was a little resentful to hear people raving about this as the Coen's best film and that it should win Best Picture. People had seen it in festivals, I think, and advanced screenings and things. I'm thinking, that annoys me because it's not a comedy and it isn't all that quirky or weird, but that's what the Coens are known for. They even got a Best Picture nomination for a film that can be described as exactly those things, funny and quirky, 11 years earlier when they were up for Fargo. And this was following a year in which Marty Scorsese finally won his Oscar for The Departed. That's a movie I really like, we covered that, but I don't think it would even make my top 5 if I ranked my Scorsese favorites. So going into No Country, I thought, not again! He, or they, will win for this? Then I actually saw the movie, and I was certainly impressed by it, but wonder if it was worthy of all this hype compared to Fargo, or Barton Fink, or even The Big Lebowski. I didn't think so. Plus I saw There Will Be Blood around the same time and knew that was the best movie I would see all year. But I feel like I'm discovering more things in No Country as the years go by. Maybe it's because I myself am becoming an old man. I'm not as long in the tooth as Tommy Lee Jones, but his biggest problem turns out to be that he can't keep up mentally with the changing times. He isn't mad about it exactly, but the world is a brutal place and it's getting even more so, which he pretty much says to his wife in the movie. He doesn't know what to do about this disconnect, and that's me now. But the story structure is fascinating. Whether Cormac McCarthy deserves most of the credit or the Coens really improved on his book, I don't know. What I like is how the story is split up evenly between Jones, Josh Brolin, and Javier Bardem, so it's easy to get sucked into all of them equally, even the murderous bad guy. One of Bardem's great scenes, and he has a lot of them, is when he has to dig a bullet out of his own leg. The process of that is fascinating. We should wish for this guy to die of lead poisoning in that moment, but I don't know that I did. Even his call it scene at the gas station, or the fact that he probably killed Brolin's wife, just because he's a maniac who can't handle if things are unfinished, doesn't make me truly turn against him. Who knew we'd get 2 of the best movie villains in 2 straight years, and both would win the supporting actor Oscar, because the next year was Heath Ledger playing the Joker in The Dark Knight.
When was Christoph Waltz playing Hans
Waltz
Landa?
was 2009, that's right, another one, 3 in a row then.
Yeah.
I forget 2010 and 2006 right now. 6 was Alan Arkin, 10, I have to think about that a minute. But those 3 in a row, you're right. Waltz might even be better than these 2. Mount Rushmore, the 3 of them, right in a row. So I know I'm going to see No Country plenty more times over the years, probably more than I'll watch There Will Be Blood. And also the more the years go by, the more I fucking love that Joel and Ethan, or McCarthy in the story, didn't give us the showdown we were expecting. It's disappointing, but kudos to them for going through with that what the fuck ending. The climax, but also the very end with Tommy Lee Jones. Hell, we don't even get any combination of the 3 main characters on screen together at any point in the film, never mind in a violent climax. Somehow, that's brilliant and gutsy. So when I run through this movie in my mind, I don't laugh like I do at their comedies, but I smile at just how good they are at telling stories.
Part of what makes the Coens incredible is how their movies are all better the more you watch them. You just understand them a little more, and it's something that could be confusing the first time you see it. It just rewards your attention so much. If I had picked No Country for Old Men, it would have ranked higher than 9. But I agree with you, it's not their best film. And speaking of the Coen brothers' best film, the year 1998, it was not even nominated for Best Picture, and that's
The Big Lebowski.
The Big Lebowski, which is my number 9, not Big Lebowski, but the film that did win, that came out in 1998.
Picture-director split, though. I said I had 9, you have at least 1 then. That was a picture-director split, because Spielberg won for directing Saving Private Ryan, and you're saying...
Shakespeare in Love, baby! A delightful film. People hated it so much back then because it beat Saving Private Ryan for Best Picture, which, to this day, is a decision I agree with. In my opinion, Shakespeare in Love is a better movie, but there was so much hate that it had convinced me, and I hadn't seen it for a while when we covered it for the podcast, and I was so surprised when we watched it to discover that I agreed with my initial opinion of it. It is a great movie. The screenplay is out of this world. It's elegant. It's a thrilling love story with so many deliciously quotable lines. But I leave it near the bottom of this list because virtually no one ever actually quotes this movie. 25 years later...
The show must go on.
Actually, one of our favorite frequent quotes is... So there's this nurse.
Tell me about this story. Well, there's this nurse. You want to encapsulate an actor? That might encapsulate the actors that work in Hollywood.
Tom Stopper really knocked it out of the park with this script. But still, 25 years later, it doesn't really enjoy that much cultural impact. I have to admit, Saving Private Ryan really did outlive this one in that sense. Big Lebowski from the same year, or isn't Truman Show also
Yes.
98? There's other movies that just weren't even nominated that have outlived it. Movies that I think really live in the cultural imagination far more than Shakespeare in Love does, unfortunately. So maybe it was the wrong choice for the Academy. Nothing else nominated for Best Picture other than Saving Private Ryan really felt to me like it got robbed. Life is Beautiful, Elizabeth, The Thin Red Line, those three movies... Nobody's like, how dare you rob Elizabeth of Best Picture?
It was a 2-horse race.
Totally. But in retrospect, I think it's safe to say that movies like The Truman Show, Pleasantville, deserved more consideration. But it doesn't change the fact that Shakespeare in Love is a great movie. It aged beautifully. It's a wonderful, creative, really clever film. A beautiful romance. It's kind of a shame that it's fading away.
I like it a lot, too. I'm sure I said that in our podcast about it, but I'm definitely a Saving Private Ryan guy, and even more so the other ones we just mentioned that weren't up against it, Pleasantville, Truman Show, and so on.
If I were to pick my favorite movie of 98, well, it probably would be Big Lebowski, and Truman Show might be second place.
But of the Best Picture nominees, you're saying Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It's great, too. It's just part of the problem is the Harvey thing, because he basically bought that Oscar. But it wasn't unworthy, as we're saying.
It's a great story because that's when Spielberg discovered,
Double down.
Oh, the world has changed and just making the best movie and casual campaigning isn't going to cut it anymore.
I'm going to buy my Oscar.
Yeah, you got to buy my Oscars. And then he started fighting fire
3
with
straight
fire.
years his studio did. American Beauty, Gladiator, A Beautiful Mind.
Yeah.
Okay, my number 8 is The Apartment. It came out in June 1960 and won 5 Oscars. Gotta be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of this movie when I saw it the first time, so that's 2 in a row I'm saying that about. I like No Country a lot. I'm just saying that people said it was incredible. I didn't fully agree. I made sure to see it because it was a Best Picture winner, but then The Apartment made the AFI's 1998 list too. And when some of my faves didn't make that list, Deliverance, Die Hard, Back to the Future, just to name 3, and I just saw The Apartment as okay, not great, I held that against it. But then a few years passed and I lived on my own in a small condo in the big city for a while, and I had a job where I felt like just a cog. I advanced, but was it worth it? And I didn't have a girlfriend, and so I came back to this movie. I watched it on New Year's Eve, appropriately, because that's how this movie ends, probably 15 or 20 years ago, and finally got it. It's a terrific film. Jack Lemmon was hysterical the year before in Some Like It Hot, but then he goes and acts funny again, but it's also about the pathos that he has in this film. In many ways, I was Bud Baxter for a few years there, although I never used a tennis racket to strain spaghetti. I didn't even make spaghetti back then. Shirley MacLaine is wonderful, and Fred MacMurray has one of the greatest, oh, dude, moments when he gives his lady, MacLaine, the woman he's been stooping, a $100 bill for a Christmas present. And then there's the ending. Some Like It Hot is maybe the greatest last line in cinema history, but shut up and deal. And what's really behind the meaning of that is almost as good. We always talk about what happens next in the movie. Well, I really want to know what happens next for Mr. Baxter and Miss Kubelik. Even at the end, they are still calling each other Mr. and Miss. And of course, this was made by Billy Wilder. Of all the classic directors, Ford, Wells, Hitchcock, Capra, he's as close to my true favorite as any of them. Part of it is the rewatchability of his movies. Part of it is the sense of humor. Part of it is the sadness and the hurt behind even his comedies. Wilder did flee the Nazis, so it makes sense that the lingering feeling of smile though your heart is breaking would impact his work. In any case, The Apartment is one of the most relatable and human of any of the Best Picture winners.
I'm like you before you had your revelation. It's a movie I like, but I've just never emotionally found the impact.
Fair enough.
And not like I've never been lonely in my life.
Did you loan out your apartment to guys to strip their girlfriends? You can relate more. But your number 8.
My number 8 is taking it way back to It Happened One Night, 1934.
Great choice.
I love this film, and there's no underestimating the impact and influence it had on all the screwball comedies of the 30s and 40s. And even though it was kind of the prototype, it's still one of the best. There's lots of great ones to choose from, but this remains one of my favorite of the screwball comedies and the blueprint for rom-coms in film. I'm sure it wasn't the first story to ever do what one would consider a rom-com, but even still now, 90 years later, rom-coms are following the formula that was honed in this film. I guess it lacks a weightiness that I feel is necessary to really call it a capital G great film. Can a film be great if its main virtue is simply to entertain flawlessly? It certainly has an advantage for me against other films made in 1934 because I looked up films of 1934, and this might be the only one I've ever seen.
Not surprising.
I'm sure that's not true about you.
No. Gable and Colbert were excellent. He didn't want to do the movie. They both won Oscars. This was the first to win the Big Five: picture, director, actor, actress, and the screenplay. I've got the other two in my list. We'll get to those soon. I love the movie too. When we ended the Top 100 project at the end of 2015, we said, what are our top 10 of their top 100? And I'm pretty sure this was in your top 10.
I've got to see it again then, because I haven't seen it since we did the podcast about it. Maybe I just need to refresh my memory of how delightful it is. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, speaking of influence, Clark Gable's performance in this film was the inspiration for none other than Bugs Bunny.
Right.
How do you outdo that as far as influence goes?
And it was truly funny. When we saw it for the project quite a few years ago, we actually laughed a lot, which was not true about a lot, and still isn't, of the old movies we've watched. All right, Rain Man is my number 7. It came out in mid-December 1988. They went on to win 4 Oscars, including a second for Dustin Hoffman as Best Actor. He'd won for Kramer vs. Kramer years before. I've said this a few times before. He had the most range of all the movie stars from his era. Nicholson, Pacino, De Niro, Hackman, Jane Fonda, Meryl Streep. Even Brando, who of course came before them, couldn't sink into roles and disappear into a character as well as Hoffman could. He went from Benjamin Braddock to Ratso Rizzo to Little Big Man to the single parent in Kramer vs. Kramer to Dorothy Michaels and Tootsie, and eventually that led him to Raymond Babbitt and Rain Man. Yes, the studio would either get an autistic guy to play the character now, or they'd be shamed for not doing that, but playing characters with a disability is so often the path to awards, and actors want to challenge themselves, and the money men want to let them. Hoffman is flat out tremendous as the toothpick counter who can beat the odds at Vegas. We're counting cards. So I'm acknowledging there are issues, but there weren't at the time. But as good as Dusty is, and I know I said this when we covered Rain Man in early 2018, this film belongs to Tom Cruise. He has the arc. He's the cocky know-it-all who learns humility, patience, and love. He's the guy who can reach his nearly unreachable brother well enough that that brother would do something he never does without practically having a seizure, reach out and touch someone. Well, also with Valeria Golino, she can kiss him, but generally speaking, you can't touch Raymond.
Wet. It was very wet.
And sparkly as well. Well, that was Iris. That scene, where at the end, Charlie, main man, puts his head on him, which apparently Hoffman improvised, that scene can yank tears out of you. It has me. Because the closed-off Raymond is reaching out to someone who himself had been pretty closed off to those around him. They end up healing each other, even if just a little bit. Because not everything's solved. Look at the cold way that Cruise still is with the Dr. Brunner character at the very end, when they're taking Raymond to the train. Many road trip movies are two-handers. It Happened One Night, good example. And we grow to love both characters. Think of Thelma and Louise. But not that many of them are as empathetic as this one. Like many of my 10 today, there are touching moments that have made me cry, but the overall theme in Rain Man of making even tiny connections with people just gets to me. 1988 was a fine year for movies. Die Hard, Bull Durham, Big, The Last Temptation of Christ, which we've all covered, were all out that year, but I think this remains worthy of the top prize. Yes, 2 white guys in a car and almost nobody of color even in the background wouldn't fly now, but I think Rain Man is universal despite that, and anyone can relate to the story, even if I as a white man can relate to it more.
Great illustration also of the impact of a movie shedding light on something that people don't know that much about. Whether it was all that accurate or not, Rain Man still is, I think, most people's go-to reference for what autism looks like.
Yeah.
Even though now, in the last 10 years, the world has really changed for representation for people on the spectrum. But I think the first thing that comes to most people's mind is counting toothpicks.
Right, and counting cards.
Yeah. Well, call it a coincidence. But you just spent some time talking about my number 7 movie, another Dustin Hoffman great, and what he won his other Oscar for, Kramer vs. Kramer from 1979. One of the great films of the 70s. Came out at the end of the decade, and it kind of represents this honed perfection of that almost like documentary, improv, authenticity. And Hoffman went full method. Meryl Streep hated him for it, but she also turned what should be the villain in the film into one of the most sympathetic characters. It's gritty and it's honest, and it's a beautiful example of how one small story can illustrate massive ideas about family, about mothers versus fathers, about the way that feminism had changed the world in that decade, and how it's both a boon to women, but a boon to men too. What starts off as a crisis ends up being this opportunity for him to develop this really fulfilling relationship with his son, and illustrating what I think fathers everywhere were missing out on. You and I were both raised by fathers in this era, well, a little later, but still raised by dads who were expected to be emotionally distant and let our moms do all of that work. We see the way our generation is raising their children, and it's just a world of difference, and I think it is one of the unsung wins of feminism that it has also gifted men this relationship with their children. And for a movie back then to be this insightful about it, we talked about Tootsie when we did the list. Tootsie is a movie that purports to be a feminist film, but when you nitpick what they're actually saying, I find it very off-putting. But Kramer versus Kramer, it feels like it does it right. That said, Ryan, what 1979 film did Kramer versus Kramer beat for Best Picture? I bet you know which one I'm talking about.
Apocalypse Now.
Yeah.
Which should have won. But I do love Kramer versus Kramer.
Kramer versus Kramer is a wonderful film, but Apocalypse Now, of course, is widely considered to be one of the greatest and most important films ever made. So it's hard for this little story of the Kramers to measure up next to this cinematic juggernaut that is Apocalypse Now. But the Academy is rarely all that forward-thinking. It's kind of in retrospect we can see how important Apocalypse Now was and is.
Well, it was following The Deer Hunter. That may have been part of why people didn't vote for another war movie. And then after Kramer versus Kramer was Ordinary People, some other regular people movies. Both were excellent. I liked them an awful lot.
Family dramas.
Raging Bull should have won that year. But I don't look back with a lot of annoyance about that. Neither of those are going to be mentioned when I talk about the biggest snubs of all time, because those two movies are really good too. I think one of the best things about Kramer versus Kramer, and we talked about it in the podcast, is the elevator scenes. There's two of them. Both times it's when Streep is on it. One going down and one going up. And one you, if not hate her, you don't know what to think. And you're certainly with Ted in that moment. And at the end, I've talked about tears. My God, how do I look? Terrific. Door closes with a perfect ending. My number 6 is The Silence of the Lambs, which was released on Valentine's Day, 1991, when I was 17 years old, literally. 13 and a half months before the show, where it eventually took home 5 Oscars. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, Eat Your Heart Out. You guys came out only about 12 months before you ended up winning a slew of your own trophies. Sometimes the recency bias is not a factor in the minds of Academy voters. Silence of the Lambs is one of the few instances where I read the book before I ever saw the film. I liked Thomas Harris's novel, and I preferred the James Gum, so the Buffalo Bill character, that's in the novel to what Ted Levine did in the movie. Not that Levine isn't tremendous as a psychopathic villain. He's just shallow in a way that he isn't in the book. Partly because you get the voiceover, what he's thinking. You don't get that in the film. But the real key, of course, is the relationship between Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins. They don't share that much screen time, and Hannibal Lecter is actually barely even in this. Hopkins only has about 20 minutes of screen time, and because they can't trust the bad doctor not to get all bitey, he's usually on camera all by himself. Yet, and I'm going to steal a line from Bram Stoker's Dracula book, which says it has a baleful spell. Baleful spell, I love that phrase. Something that Lecter casts all over Silence of the Lambs. He doesn't actually help Clarice very much. He toys with her, actually, and he really toys with people who offend him. At least he doesn't seem to be offended by her. Well, maybe by her cheap shoes. But because Clarice respects him and possibly even likes him, we just can't hate the guy. Plus, anytime a character is as smart as fuck and gets to say all these great lines, it's hard not to put your lot in with them, even if you know you shouldn't, because he's a goddamn maniac who's killed and eaten people, and will again. So the two villains are great, and Scott Glenn does a solid job as Clarice's boss, but the key of keys is Jodie Foster. Now, I think Michelle Pfeiffer would have hit a home run doing this too, and she could have had the role, but she turned it down. And other actresses might have been awesome themselves. But maybe it's that early shot of this tiny woman in an elevator full of men who tower over her that makes you worry for her and win you over to her side right away. Then it happens again in the funeral home when they go inspect that first body. No one does end up hurting Clarice, and we know she's a pretty good FBI agent who can handle herself. She's the one that kills Buffalo Bill. But she seems to represent a broad spectrum of women who felt like they have to prove they're good enough and strong enough and smart enough and courageous enough to have any chance to succeed. Clarice is 6th, or was 6th, on the heroic side of the AFI's Heroes and Villains list, and she's the highest ranked woman. I wasn't always sure that was the right call, but now I am, and it's for the reasons I just gave. So huge credit to Thomas Harris for his book, and Jonathan Demme for directing this thriller to Oscars. That was rare, a thriller to win Oscars, over a year after it came out, and it won the Big Five, just like It Happened One Night did. This nasty little piece of work is the one that would stick in people's minds, and has it ever, even if it's so unlike the uplifting, non-genre movies that usually end up winning all the awards.
Yeah, great example of when the Academy just got everything 100% right. It's a shame that when we look back on this movie, which is nearly perfect, that we have to add the caveat that back then They didn't know better than to be tremendously idiotic in their assumptions of what trans people are like. The cruelty and just the sheer wrongness of how they blame Buffalo Bill's behavior on the fact that he's transgender, it's clownishly absurd. I wonder how harmful it could possibly be because it's just so dead wrong.
30 years ago, based on
totally.
The 80s.
Yeah, totally. Evidence for people to see how far we have come in the past 30 years. But it's a shame that it has to have that asterisk at all, because I agree with everything you said. The performances, Jodie Foster, the screenplay, the story itself is just tight as a drum, edge of your seat, and Anthony Hopkins, chef's kiss.
Okay, you're number 6.
A very different movie. Couldn't possibly be more different. I picked Nomadland, a very recent winner. But despite being only 3 years old this year, I do think it's a modern classic. I think it's an American masterpiece. Just talking about it makes my heart feel big. It challenges our expectations. It's a subject that ought to elicit pity from its audience, but instead it fills you with joy and hope. From extreme poverty comes this faith in humanity. Its biggest strengths are two things: the force of nature that is Frances McDormand, an absolute legend, and all the non-actors who make up most of the cast and are the real nomads of the American West. I dare anyone not to fall in love with them and this fascinating subculture. But most of all, it is about America and freedom, small f freedom, and the way that life can still be fulfilling and meaningful even after capitalism has chewed you up and spit you out. Perhaps it errs on the side of sentimentality and doesn't really do enough to address that. A lot of people who live this life aren't really actively choosing it, like Fern is. Anyway, I don't know why I'm nitpicking. I adore this film. I find it just so profoundly moving and beautiful. 2020 I found to be a great year for film. Of course, release dates are gonna have to come with a lot of asterisks because, the pandemic completely fucked up release schedules, and the Oscars did their best to accommodate by airing the show late, being flexible. But I love 2020 for film because all the studios kind of sat on their big releases, and it gave all the space for indies to shine. And you get these wonderful films that I don't think would have risen above and been seen in another year. And that includes Nomadland and Minari, which, oh God, I love that movie. The Father, Sound of Metal, and also more genre films like Promising Young Woman and Invisible Man, movies that could have sunk under the weight of bigger releases in another year.
I like the movie a ton too. I would say it's probably my number 2 that year behind Minari. Although I think I might watch Nomadland more over the years. And in that podcast, we talked about how the scene with Bob kills me more because my cousin killed himself. I guess it was only a few months after we saw the movie, or maybe even weeks. And he talks about his son killing himself. And that dude is so real in that moment. And the great line about how I never say goodbye. It's I'll see you down the road. And then, of course, also the scene with, I forget her name now, but the one talking about how she could have died in that perfect moment. Those scenes are going to touch me more as I get older and reflect on these kinds of things. And as people die, they're older than us and other people we care about. And of course, Frances McDormand is awesome. Chloe Zhao directed that, won the Best Picture Oscar as well as directing.
Was the second woman to ever win Best Director.
So number 5 is Forrest Gump, which won 6 Oscars and first saw the light of day in July 1994. When I saw just the poster for this movie, I knew I was in. And I wasn't even quite as loony for Tom Hanks as I am now, save for whatever the fuck he's doing in Elvis. Then I saw Gump, and it became one of my favorite movies, period. Yes, I know it was the Pulp and Shawshank year. The internet comes at the mere thought of the prison drama that I saw twice on the big screen in 94 and then into 95, but most people didn't bother to see it in the theater at all. Fuck you, then. And a lot of fanboys hate Gump simply because it beat Pulp. I love those other two myself. It's funny, actually, how all 3 great films that seem so different, all up for the Oscar, actually have a lot in common. All 3 movies are funny, especially Gump and Pulp, and those 2 have some incredible soundtracks, but all 3 also have some pretty disturbing violence. But Forrest Gump being so different from most other movies is one reason I latched onto it. Bob Zemeckis made this oddball motion picture work with the comedy and the tragedy and the politics of the 60s and the subtext of incestuous rape and how America doesn't really care about you if you're a poor Southern woman or if you're a disabled war veteran. To make these characters, particularly Forrest himself, feel so real despite the unreal things that happen, especially to him, is a testament to Zemeckis, Hanks, and the whole team. Yet as great as Tom is, winning his 2nd straight Oscar, what keeps bringing me back is just as much Jenny as it is Forrest. Jenny. And Bubba, and Lieutenant Dan. I wanted to say that so much I should have said in the podcast. Not Lieutenant Dan, it's Lieutenant Dan if you're Canadian. Why it's Lieutenant British people, I don't know. Robin Wright was brilliant as Jenny, and you feel every pain she has gone through in her life in that film. Then when you see how she is when we meet little Forrest, you also have to smile because she seems like she's got herself in a good place, finally. For a little while, at least. I know that "I miss you, Jenny" at the end messes you up, but Forrest could be saying that to Mama and to Bubba, too. Bubba also died way too young, and it wasn't like Mama was exactly a geezer herself. I don't want to outlive my best friend or my wife. Well, you are maybe my best friend, but okay, my second best friend. And I sure hope that a friend of mine isn't driven by rage about how the world took half his body away from him. But I hope I can be 1/10 as classy about how I handle those kinds of troubles as Forrest Gump is. Maybe it's because he's dumb, but he handles it so well. He's a great human being. This movie has heart, but it also stings in the right ways. And it's a lot like Castaway, a movie that they made together, Zemeckis and Hanks, 6 years later.
Hard agree with everything you said. I could definitely nitpick it more than you do.
Yeah,
I
I
think
could too.
it's like a pretty flawed movie, but I'll be damned. I just don't care. I can watch this movie beginning to end any day of the week, no matter how many times I've seen it. And just you talking about "I miss you, Jenny," I seriously felt myself get just a titch misty. I'm not making that up. All right, my number 5 of the movies I picked from the popcorn box is 1984's Amadeus. It's luscious, it's beautiful, it's full of scandal and joie de vivre. It feels like it's both firmly grounded and just light as a feather, like a magic trick. Milos Forman makes the past feel present. Tom Hulce and F. Murray Abraham are perfect foils.
F. Murray Abraham.
They turn this, it should be the stuffiest film genre, right, into instead one of the most beautiful, painfully honest portrayals of envy on screen. And it's just so much fun. It's a perfect film, honestly, and one of the best films of the 80s, in my opinion. The other Best Picture nominees of that year were no real competition. We're talking A Soldier Story, I've never even heard of that, Places in the Heart, Killing Fields, and A Passage to India. No one was really going to stand up to that, but it's funny because then you look up other films of 1984.
One of the great years of the 80s.
One of the great years of film, period. Yeah. It just happened to be a great year for genre films. 16 Candles, Footloose, Gremlins, Nightmare on Elm Street, Ghostbusters, This Is Spinal Tap, Neverending Story.
The Terminator.
The Terminator? Oh my god, I missed that one too. Splash, Romancing the Stone, Top Secret, Karate Kid. What an incredible year for films, but all of them films that the Academy always ignores. Because they're horror, they're comedy, or they're indie. I don't know if you're really saying what's the best movie of 1984, you would pick Amadeus. But of the best movie of Oscar Beatty films...
Easily.
Yeah, easily. And it's a beautiful movie.
I liked it more when we saw it for the podcast a few years ago. It wasn't like I didn't like it the first time. I saw it on the big screen getting re-released in, I think, 2001. The music, of course, is great. The two guys are great. And we've seen many movies that have homaged the Amadeus template ever since, including Good Will Hunting in many ways.
Oh, yeah. The screenplay based on a play...
Peter Shaffer.
Out of this world.
Yeah, very good film. My number 4 is The Bridge on the River Kwai, which came out in the fall and winter of 1957. It won 7 Academy Awards. I think it might be the best long epic I've ever seen. Okay, there are 2 more titles on my list that are even longer, and since they're higher on this list, I'm obviously saying they're better. But Bridge is just one of the most rewatchable butt-numbers there's ever been. Plus, those 2 other long epics aren't action-adventure pictures like Bridge is. So that makes this more epic than them anyway. I think one of them made the epics list, but I don't really think of it as an epic film. This, of course, you do. I caught the last 20 or 30 minutes on TCM a few weeks ago, but it was only because I had other things to do that I didn't go hunt for the Blu-ray downstairs and start from scratch. Alec Guinness won the Best Actor Oscar, but the whole cast is authentic as hell. Yes, it's almost entirely men in this one, but older movies often were almost entirely by and about men. Having said that, it's curious that the playboy of the film, William Holden, has an almost feminine, or at least more humanistic, attitude compared to the other characters. He doesn't want to go blow up the bridge for a lot of reasons, but one of them is because, as he says, it's not more important to die like a gentleman than it is to live like a human being. In the end, his character does do the macho thing and, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert, dies for it, but at least he wasn't acting like a posturing macho man the whole time. Alec Guinness is awesome, but you want to strangle him in a lot of ways, as you do Saito, the Japanese colonel, and the guy that's with Holden on the mission to blow up the bridge. Fuck all of them as human beings. That's not a rag on the performances of the other guys or the script. It's just a comment on the blinders-on assholes who surround Holden Shear's character, who is more humanistic. And David Lean. Was there a better director of epic movies? We know about the beauty of Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, but this dirty, sweaty film is great to look at in its own right. I'd rather throw this in the Blu-ray player 5 different times in the next week than those other 2 even once. That's not saying Lawrence isn't a marvelous movie, and I've always been a sucker for Zhivago, but Bridge diabolically draws you in almost like it's a hushed chamber piece, rather than a massive production about death and destruction. And as Spielberg says, it's all about the name of the movie at the very end. Everything comes together at that end. It's one of the greats.
Hard agree. My favorite David Lean movie, and it's not even close. The ending, you're just so invested by the time they get there. Oh, wonderful movie. All right, huge left turn here, because my number 4 movie is La La Land. Just kidding, it's Moonlight.
You guys have won Best Picture. This is not a joke.
When I think about Moonlight, I always immediately conjure up that final shot of the film. It's as much a beginning as it is an ending, that beautiful final shot. It never fails to elicit a huge emotional reaction for me. It's a feast for the eyes. And while the plot is told in a pretty unconventional way, it's still really engaging. The stakes feel so high. You're always invested. But the real artistry is just the way it draws you into Chiron's world and his state of mind so thoroughly that the emotional payoff is beyond moving. It's unforgettable. You don't get many protagonists that are further away from my own personal experience than Chiron is, yet good lord, I care so deeply about what becomes of him. I know that the art filminess of it has alienated some viewers, and it made a pretty bold and surprising choice for Academy voters. No one was more surprised, of course, than Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty, of course. But it was also this huge sign of progress, considering that this same voting body couldn't give the award to the very obvious actual Best Picture of 2005, which I will be talking about later, probably because of homophobia. And just 11 years later, this strange, very black, very gay art film that deeply examines masculinity is beating quite a few pretty decent and definitely safer choices.
Not big hits in some cases, too.
Yes, not just La La Land, which is, let's face it, already disappearing from public consciousness. I dare anybody to name one song from that musical.
We didn't like it as much as the second time.
No. When I watched it again, I was like, oh,
City of Stars, that is a good song.
Okay, fine, you can name me one song. But Arrival, Hidden Figures, even something like Manchester by the Sea, this is the kind of stuff the Academy loves to vote for. But they voted for Moonlight, the brave, beautiful, one-of-a-kind Moonlight.
I don't know what you just said. I was tweeting. The guy who messed up the envelopes was tweeting. That's why I say that.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
You have one job, you idiot.
Oh, wow.
Give him the right envelope. Anyway, that in some ways was good, I think, for Moonlight, because I've watched that Oscar moment so many times. And if it had just been done properly, it would have been a landmark for people like us, but the average person would never have remembered that. So I think in a lot of ways, that was a tribute. And the way that people reacted, too. Sam Jackson was crying. Pharrell Williams, I think is his name, had this, oh my God, what just happened type moment. A lot of people did, obviously. But just from the movie itself, I don't like it as much as you do, but I like it an awful lot, too. The actors are terrific across the board. The women and the men. And yeah, the black gay movie winning is so unusual for the Oscars. But the 2010s were that kind of time frame where the movie you didn't expect to win did. Spotlight winning the year before was a surprise. And Moonlight deserved it more than La La Land. I would have voted for probably Manchester by the Sea at the time, but I don't know if I would anymore. So it's a very good film, and I'm glad it did win in the end. Number 3 for me is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, a surprise blockbuster that came out in November 1975 and, like Silence of the Lambs, won the top 5 Oscars: picture, director, actor, actress, and the screenplay. For a movie set in a mental hospital and one that might be the epitome of people sitting around in rooms talking, it's one of the most engaging films the Academy has ever given the top trophy. Maybe I like it because some of the best scenes are sports-related. The fishing trip is fun, but the basketball game and McMurphy's imagined baseball game on the television make me want to stand up and cheer like the Blue Jays just won the World Series. Their joy, all those patience, as brief as it is for these henpecked men, is thrilling. I saw those scenes again recently on YouTube, and still, yeah, the way they're so excited. And the man inspiring all these nuts to stop groveling for the approval of their manipulative nurse and go live life is one of my favorite actors. Jack Nicholson should have won the Oscar before this, but he's phenomenal as R.P. McMurphy and finally did win the trophy. Mac is far from perfect, and he's a statutory rapist, for God's sake, although he claims that he didn't know she was too young. But he also might be a better role model for these cowed men than their doctors and nurses ever could be. I know Bev, for one, believes in therapy, but I've always been a bit skeptical, and maybe this movie contributes to that. Dr. Spivey is fucking useless, while Louise Fletcher as Nurse Ratched is among the most awesome villains you'll ever see, but her power is more important to her than actually helping these guys. She's the Ben Linus from Lost of this movie. I suppose some might say the film is misogynistic because of how much Ratched enjoys just how much she has these guys by the balls. But the whole game changes when you find out they're voluntarily committed. And they're still there at the end of the movie despite all that happens. So this is a lot on them. Miloš Forman came from Czechoslovakia, back when it still was Czechoslovakia, and he knew about oppression. The tone this director maintains in this is masterful. It shouldn't be as entertaining or as fun as it is. It shouldn't mean as much to me as it does, since I can't really relate to what they're going through. And we shouldn't be quite so happy for a kid getting fucked by a girl he barely knows, and then conquering his stutter for one sentence, although what a great moment. I certainly am thrilled by that. I don't know about you, but no, I'm not. It's one of the great moments in the entire film. And these are the complicated things that make a picture great, because much like Whiplash, I don't always feel the same way about this movie when it's over that I did the last time. Oh, and somebody get me a fucking wiener before I die. Nicholson says that during the baseball game.
Yeah. I don't know why you think I don't like this movie. I love this movie. I love the book more, and I read the book.
I love the book too.
Yeah. I read the book twice before I saw the movie, and it's funny how the movie's so loyal to the book and the plot, but the tone feels dramatically different.
Because it's Chief is the protagonist.
Yeah, he's the narrator, so you see it all through his distorted point of view because he's a very sick man. I am a fan of therapy and psychology as a practice in general. I don't like that this film actually did set back therapy or psychiatry for decades because it gave everybody this horrible impression of what life is like inside a mental institution. Not to say that they don't have things to account for, but the movie's really just about a power struggle. It's about freedom. It's about life under a petty tyrant. And it doesn't matter how small your world is, oppression can be very real, even if it's just from this seemingly innocent nurse. And God, she is truly one of the greatest villains of all time. It could be a Rorschach test, too, for all of the ways that society or your family or relationships could be oppressing you in your life. It's such an interesting movie.
Number 3 for you.
Another modern movie, and definitely one of my favorites of this century, Parasite. Man, I have never stopped thinking about this immaculate, hilarious, surprising, thrilling, and thoughtful masterpiece. The fact that it takes place so far away from the world that we know, it just further illustrates how universal these themes are. And it's one of my favorite kinds of films in the sense that everything feels deeply precise and intentional. Every picture on the wall was thought about and selected carefully so we can analyze every choice that Bong Joon-ho makes. Bong Joon-ho has always had this bone to pick with capitalism, and I think this is the film where he finally found the perfect vehicle to illustrate his point. And like Moonlight, this film has an absolutely perfect last shot, only it has this totally opposite effect. Instead of offering catharsis, it ramps up the tension that virtually every person living in this capitalist society is living with every day. And talk about cultural impact, even when you adjust for the remarkable feat of a Korean film that broke the language barrier and became a sensation worldwide, becoming the first non-English film to win Best Picture, depending on how you consider Slumdog Millionaire, which has like a...
Godfather 2. But...
Yeah, films that have different languages in them. It has become shorthand for this simmering resentment the working class feels for the wealthy and the way the whole system is a trap that we're helpless to escape from. 2019 was an embarrassment of riches for the Academy, and yet it still felt overwhelmingly like the right choice. Look how the crowd reacted. Do you remember that moment?
Yeah.
They're trying to wrap it up, and they're, no, let them finish. I love that.
Lights up,
everyone was just overjoyed for Bong Joon-ho and that crew, and one of my favorite Oscar moments.
I like the movie a lot too, but the thing I want to focus on in response to you is the other Oscar moment, and I've mentioned it so many times, when during his speech, Bong Joon-ho references Martin Scorsese, and he gets a standing ovation during someone else's Oscar acceptance speech. What a great tribute. Maybe even better than if Marty had won the Oscar, and he shouldn't have anyway for The Irishman. I like Parasite a lot too. Number 2 is Schindler's List, the Holocaust movie that came out on Christmas Day, 1993, and went on to win 7 Oscars. I have to be honest that this ranking is more about respect than about actually loving this one. I don't watch this film very often. I've seen it 4 times and don't expect to make it 5 next week or even next year. But that's a compliment. This is one of the most devastating motion pictures anyone has ever made. It isn't what represents Steven Spielberg the best, though. That would be E.T. It isn't the most fun he ever was on screen, obviously. That would be Raiders. And it isn't my favorite of all of his films. That would be Always. Wait, no, should read Jaws. But for a guy to go so far out of his wheelhouse and try to express on film what others had tried to show, but just hadn't captured quite like this, he deserves all the praise and all the awards. And this movie won 7 of them. And maybe some level of suffering isn't that far out of Steve's wheelhouse, if you think about it. We learned in The Fabelmans, which we didn't like, that he didn't have the easiest childhood. He was a lonely, confused Jewish kid who was born right around the time World War II was ending, i.e., right after people who share his heritage have been eradicated for several years over in Europe. And it's not that Schindler's List isn't entertaining. We said when we covered it back in 2015 that for a 3-hour and 15-minute film, it really moves. Michael Kahn won 3 Oscars in his career, but maybe he deserved it for this one more than even Raiders or Saving Private Ryan. They're the other 2 he won for. And that's because this never feels like a slog. When it's over, you feel ruined, yes, but you don't feel like, come on, Steve, let's keep things moving, like you do in The Fabelmans. You often do in his recent work, in fact. At least we do. Spielberg didn't really rely on his traditional gliding tracking shots and cranes and glitz. Janusz Kaminski, as a cinematographer, did the very opposite with his lighting that he's been doing for about 10 years now, which is overlighting everything, and I know you feel this way, and having lens flares in nearly every single shot. Here, no. They make it feel like a documentary. They put you there. Liam Neeson is dignified and empathetic as Oscar Schindler, and I like his work in this a lot, but Ben Kingsley is the heart of the film. But Ralph Fiennes, man, what a blow-away great villain. The guy is probably always going to be remembered for playing Voldemort, but there's so much more complexity in Amangert that this pot-bellied smoker would be part of this master race is a brilliant bit of hypocrisy. Who looked at fucking Adolf Hitler and thought, yes, we should all aspire to look like that guy, or even this guy, Amangert, who looks better than Hitler did, of course. A horrible but incredible scene is when Goethe forgives a Jewish kid for not being able to clean the bathtub. Go on, leave, I pardon you. Because Schindler had told him that's what he should do more often, so he's taking his friend's advice. But the Nazi shithead thinks about it, preens in the mirror, and then just fucking rifle shots the kid anyway. I can see why Spielberg needed Robin Williams to do a stand-up act on the phone for him while he was making this movie. But here's one sad note I always have to make when talking about this film that actually has nothing to do with this film. I agree when people say, never again, about genocide and the Holocaust. But just a few weeks after this motion picture was winning all these awards and had even done well at the box office, so it was on everyone's mind, is what I'm saying, there was a fucking genocide happening in Rwanda. The Hutus were slaughtering the Tutsis and the West was doing nothing about it. So often again, not never again. And one last thing about the end of Schindler's List, when Neeson breaks down about how he didn't save enough Jews, the guilt he has messes me up just picturing it, never mind actually watching that scene. It's a great release after 3 hours of, as Cher said in the AFI special, holding your breath the whole time.
I co-signed everything you said. Deserves number 2 spot. It's just an outstanding and really important film that somehow never gets bogged down under the weight of it all. Never shies away from it either. Mm-hmm.
And as we say, fairly entertaining for a movie of its type.
And my number 2 film is much, much more fun and much, much less consequential, and that is All About Eve. Oh. Sumptuous, scandalous, and just delicious. I love this movie. Bette Davis is just a force of nature with this outstanding Mankiewicz screenplay, which he directed himself. He was the director of the film as well. The cast deserves a massive amount of credit for the success of this film, but I think you could also make the argument for the importance of the film's casting director as well, because rarely is a film as perfectly and beautifully cast as this. In 1950, there's only 2 films that could have arguably dethroned All About Eve.
One of them I like even more.
Yes. No one could really be mad about All About Eve winning, but one of your all-time favorite movies, Sunset Boulevard. The other one is a Sight and Sound favorite over the years, and that's Kurosawa's Rashomon, which the Academy was never going to...
Wasn't nominated.
It wasn't nominated because it's a Japanese film. I don't think most American viewers probably would have even had a chance to see Rashomon at that point.
I think it won the foreign language Oscar back then, but it didn't get nominated.
Oh, it did? Oh, okay. Sunset Boulevard would be its real competition, and you and I are always going to be on opposite ends of this, although who could argue the validity of either of these films? They're both really good.
I love All About Eve too, but this is one of the ones we traded. There may have been when you traded me, what was it you traded me, Rain Man?
Rain Man or The Sting.
Yeah, and I think All About Eve is the one I had. I like it a lot, but I knew you'd like it even more. Bette Davis is great, and I love, too, that she probably should have won her 3rd Best Actress Oscar, but she was really a supporting character in this film. Yeah, All About Eve is a great one, but I knew you'd like it even more. You know what we're going to do? Actually, I just thought of this when you were talking. Let's build up number 1 for each of us by looking what's in the box right now, and then I think I have a feeling what maybe one of yours is, unless it's in this box. So,
okay.
So we'll do the box now.
You'll remember better than I do what
I don't remember what I picked.
Were.
We did this weeks ago. All right, so here's what's not going to get mentioned in any extensive way. Chicago. Really good film. We both like an awful lot. We covered it, of course. Ordinary People. Covered that a couple years ago. Very good film. Platoon, which you probably don't like as much as me, but that was a great war film.
That was my putback. We were allowed to put one back. It was Platoon.
And Godfather Part 2. I thought maybe you would have Godfather Part 2, but you do not, because here it is right here.
Oh, so you don't know what my number one is?
I don't know. I thought maybe you had that one.
Well,
Because my number one is The Godfather.
of course.
Is there a more iconic Best Picture winner? It has all the credibility to be called that. It was a smash hit. It was critically acclaimed. The cast is excellent from top to bottom. There are 8 or 10 quotable lines. It only won 3 Oscars, but 3 very important ones. So, of course, picture, but also the screenplay, and Brando for Best Actor were the other 2. And who would have complained even then, never mind now, if it had won for the editing, or the costumes, or Francis Coppola for his direction, or at least one of the 3 guys who were for supporting actor, Duvall, Pacino, and Caan. Al Pacino has had an incredible career, but he'll always be Michael Corleone to most people. That or Tony Montana, which is fitting since both of those characters, and both The Godfather and Scarface, have a lot in common, if you think about their arcs. It's almost like Scarface is the sleazy Godfather. Of course, this movie is made richer by the existence of Part 2, which we're not going to talk about now, and then harmed by the existence of Part 3. I actually like Part 3 more than a lot of people do. It has at least one of the best lines in the entire series. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. What the first one has most of all is originality. Yeah, it's based on a book, so it's not original, but I've heard the book is nowhere near as good as the film anyway. And yeah, there were, and have been since, many gangster movies, often with great actors and great production values, just like this. Goodfellas is a good example. But are they just copies of The Godfather? And do they have the layers and complexity? If any of them do, Goodfellas maybe might be the only one that's even close to this. Well, Godfather too, but it's part of the same series. For instance, what I heard a few years ago is the story that Vito helped Michael plan the murders of the heads of the 5 families, even though it was Vito who said he wouldn't be the one to break the peace we have made today. I was disappointed because I thought he was an honest man, considering what he does for a living, but I also thought, that's genius. Of course this man would do that if he thought it made financial sense or was going to be better for the Corleones, and we see in Part 2 that he's not above doling out cold revenge, as he does to the guy who murdered his family in Sicily when he was a boy. Still, it's fascinating that this man who belongs in prison 100 times over seems to be, in this world, someone with a true sense of honor. He certainly has more than his own son does, but if he knew about Michael's call to kill all those guys and help devise it, then he's just a cheap mafia hood like all the rest of them after all. And yet still, it's not that simple. Maybe that's because Brando's so great in the film, and his hospital scene with Pacino is not only tense and a bittersweet reunion for father and son, but it represents what I think is the most important sentence in movie history. I'm with you now. Because it means 5 things, or at least 3 things. Jimmy Caan is so beloved as Sonny, and I think he's great, but I'm with Tom Hanks. I love Robert Duvall in this as much as anyone. But this is Pacino's movie, even more than Brando's, and he's the one with the incredible arc. Yet I shouldn't overlook Diane Keaton, or Talia Shire, or John Cazale, more so for the second one, I guess, Richard Conte, Richard Castellano, Abe Vigoda. If ever an entire cast should have been given one giant Oscar to trade off every weekend, almost like the Stanley Cup, it's the cast of The Godfather. And the second one, too. And that team effort was rewarded, other than with the 1972 Best Picture and all the love this has had for half a century. It does insist upon itself, though, as Peter Griffin said. It insists upon itself. At last year's Oscars, it was recognized when Coppola, Pacino, and Robert De Niro came out on stage for a few minutes to, remind us The Godfather's 50 years old. Coppola paid tribute to the guy who wrote the book and co-wrote the script, Mario Puzo, who's now dead, and then Francis thanked Robert Evans, who's also now dead. Evans ran Paramount when this was released. The two of them had feuded during production, and Coppola held a grudge for all those years. But even though Evans wasn't alive to hear it last year, Coppola finally acknowledged and graciously thanked him for his part in making this landmark film, thus burying old hatchets in a way that I guess even Vito Corleone couldn't. I don't watch The Godfather yearly like I do Jaws and Groundhog Day and It's a Wonderful Life and Galaxy Quest, which is probably more than once a year. And I haven't even seen it in several years. But I bet you I could list most of the story beats right now and could certainly rattle off a ton of the great quotes. I already have. The Godfather is legendary for so many reasons, though, and I'm taking the safe route and making it number 1. But if it isn't the greatest of the 10 films I pulled out of the box, I'd like to hear the argument for what's better. Besides, my list is my business, and never ask me about my business again.
If I had picked The Godfather, it would have been number 1 for me. But I didn't pick The Godfather, so my number 1 is Casablanca. Putting this on top was a no-brainer. Just immediately as soon as I saw it. It is just the most delightful, wonderful film. Give it all the awards. It's old Hollywood craftsmanship at its very best. Perfectly cast. A perfect script. And just so much talent that had no idea they were making one of the greatest films ever made. There's suspense, there's humor, and my God, there's romance. And imagine that when this film was being made and released, no one knew what the outcome of the Second World War was going to be yet. Right. It makes the hope and that idealism so much more moving when you put it into that proper context. Do you know why this competed against films that came out in 1943 when it was released in 1942?
I looked it up and I forget why. but I get why you asked that question. Yes, it's the 43 Best Picture winner, but it technically came out in 1942. I think probably around Christmas time.
I saw somewhere that it was released in January of 1943.
Well,
So
a lot of
maybe...
movies we've talked about today really did get released in January, but they qualified for the Oscars by being out of New York and LA at the end of the year before.
So it's bizarre. So I'll compare it to other 1943 films. It really didn't have any meaningful competition. It was up against 9 other films. The only 2 that I recognized were The Oxbow Incident and Heaven Can Wait.
Oxbow Incident's awesome.
I love Oxbow Incident.
But this is better.
It's not Casablanca. Casablanca is Casablanca.
One of the most quotable movies of all time. The last 2 are number 1 each. Were probably the most quotable movies of all. Well, Star Wars is probably in that list. But, okay, 2 of, anyway. Casablanca and The Godfather. And one of the great endings of all time, too. If Rick gets on that plane with them, or somehow they kill off Victor Laszlo, even tragically, you love her anyway, take her and save her, Rick. That would be good. But the fact he doesn't go is so much better. And I've said it before, a lot of the great love stories, they don't end up happily ever after. And this is a great example of that. And it's for noble sacrifice. It isn't Dr. Zhivago, which is also tragic the way that ends, the very last couple of shots. This is, everyone's healthy and well, at least for now. But Rick says, no, go off with him. He's bigger than all of us and he needs you. And that's bigger than me. Excellent film. I think we picked the best ones we could have, of the ones we picked from the box. It's good we both didn't get.
We're great at this.
And the AFI, too. Citizen Kane didn't win, so we couldn't have talked about that. We're going to in a minute. But Casablanca, Godfather, and Kane are the top 3 in both of their AFI lists, 1998 and 2007. Just the order was different.
Yeah, Casablanca and Godfather switched places. Mm-hmm. That's what it was.
Okay, that was our 10 best ever that have won Best Picture, and I mentioned the other ones we didn't actually pick out of the box, which we could have. Okay, now we'll talk about what we think are the biggest snubs for Best Picture. There are some examples of what might seem like a miscarriage of justice, like Forrest Gump versus Pulp Fiction, or Goodfellas versus Dances with Wolves, or Network versus Rocky, or Apocalypse Now versus Kramer versus Kramer. But in all those cases, I like the one that won Best Picture almost as much as the one that didn't. Or at least I like it a lot. So I won't include any of those. I'm also not going to get worked up about winners from the first 10 or 15 years of the Oscars, like The Wizard of Oz not winning over Gone with the Wind, or The Grapes of Wrath losing out to Rebecca. So that was the proviso. Here now are our 5. Well, I guess I'll do 5. Bev didn't have time to do 5. She's going to do 1. So I'll do a couple, then Bev will do her 1, then I'll come back to the rest of mine. For worst picks for Best Picture compared to a movie that was at least nominated against it. So no 2001 versus Oliver, or Back to the Future versus Out of Africa, because 2001 and Back to the Future weren't even candidates. Number 5 is 1996, when Fargo and Jerry Maguire were both far more worthy than The English Patient. Now, I haven't seen the one about how the Nazi got burned half to death and we should feel sorry for him in a long time, and it was only once that I did see it. But who even talks about it anymore? Did anyone talk about it even 1 year later, when Titanic won? But Fargo is still funny and goofy and even cool, plus it stars one of the greatest actors of the last 40 years in her best role, which is Frances McDormand as Marge Gunderson, although she finally got she won the Oscar that year, but then she got 2 more acting Oscars, and of course she won Best Picture for Nomadland. I've seen Fargo more than any film from 1996, other than maybe Jerry Maguire, which isn't perfect, but it was iconic even then, and it certainly is now. We talked about quotable, 2 of the most famous quotes of all time are in that movie, Show Me the Money and You Had Me at Hello. It's probably the best thing either Tom Cruise or Cameron Crowe has ever done. My number 4. I thought about shitting on An American in Paris or The Greatest Show on Earth, or even A Man for All Seasons in my number 4 slot, because A Streetcar Named Desire, High Noon, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf were just so much better than those 3. But I ended up settling on something that has its moments, but I just like the other movies so much more, and I think you agree. I know you agree. And that's 1964, when My Fair Lady beat out Dr. Strangelove. We've raved about Strangelove 100 times on this channel, partly because of how relevant a nuclear apocalypse was to people during the Cold War in the 1960s. But far better than that, it's one of the funniest movies ever made. Feeding you, Jack, feeding you. And we love to quote that line, but there are another 20 you could quote. My Fuhrer, I can walk. Look at the big board. But My Fair Lady was a pretty good musical that won Best Picture just 3 years after another pretty good musical won over A Better Choice, and that was West Side Story over The Hustler. Musicals had been winning plenty of Best Picture Oscars over the years, so they weren't overdue in 1964. It wasn't like, we got to reward a musical. You'd rewarded plenty of them. I love Audrey Hepburn, but she's miscast in My Fair Lady, and she's not very believable when she's playing the street urchin. Yeah, this is Rex Harrison's signature role, and he's pretty great. But much like my number 1 choice that's coming up in a few minutes, it's hard to look past the fact that the end of My Fair Lady has the leading character no longer being such an asshole to the other leading character, but just barely. And people raved about how he'd grown. Where the devil are my slippers? Wow, what growth. It's a clever callback line, but the more time goes by, as time goes by, the more I think My Fair Lady isn't very good, never mind the best film of that year. So comments on My Fair Lady versus Strangelove, and what was the other one I just said? I've already forgotten. Oh, 1996, English Patient, Jerry Maguire, Fargo.
Oh, hard agree. I like English Patient a lot better than you do, but Fargo and Jerry Maguire, come on, all these years later, they're just iconic. And Doctor Strangelove is one of my all-time favorite movies. I understand why the Academy wouldn't pick it, because it is pitch black dark.
Yeah, the world ends at the end of it. So.
Yeah. But that's part of what I love about it.
Yeah. Let's do your one choice here right now.
Okay. So I would have found it hard to come up with 5, because I'm often amazed at how personally people can take the Oscars, because even as a person who adores the Oscars, like I do, I just can't fix myself to get worked up about choices the voters have made that I don't agree with one notable exception, and that is Crash's win over Brokeback Mountain in 2006. In a ceremony that was way too recent to be excusable, the Academy voters were so fucking homophobic that they picked possibly history's most embarrassing Best Picture win. And what's more embarrassing is that these grown-ups were so spooked by a film that made them imagine for 1 minute what it might feel like to be a man in love with another man. Or the fact that they ate up Crash, a movie that panders transparently to rich white people who want to be absolved of any blame for racist systems. I truly will never forgive them for this.
You said 2006, but of course the movies come out in...
The Oscars aired in 2006.
Yeah, 2005.
The 2006 Oscars, these films both came out in 2005.
Yeah. I like Crash more than you do, of course, but I agree with Brokeback. I don't know if I thought so at the time, but when we covered it for the podcast a few years ago, I liked it that much more, and I've been thinking about it a lot, and I do want to see it again. I feel like I'm going to be a puddly mess beside you.
Haha, let's do it. Let's be puddly messes together.
But Crash is trying to do some things that a movie I just mentioned did, and what I'm going to mention at the end of this did, very clumsily. It's not like it's a bad movie, but I don't think it's a bad movie.
I think it's a terrible movie.
Okay. 1944 is my number 3 choice. That was the year Going My Way won, but it should have been Double Indemnity, another dark black and white movie like Dr. Strangelove. Going My Way won 7 awards, but Double Indemnity didn't win for any of its 7 nominations. Maybe crime thrillers with a truly evil woman in the leading role should have felt lucky to even get Oscar recognition at all. Billy Wilder was already a master filmmaker, even though this was only his 3rd or 4th movie as a director. This is maybe the best noir ever. It's certainly on the short list with The Maltese Falcon and Chinatown. But yeah, nobody talks about Going My Way anymore the way they do Double Indemnity. Although in fairness, just like The English Patient, I have to admit that I only saw Going My Way once, more than 20 years ago. Maybe we'll cover it next year when it's 80 years old. Plus, it went up against one of my very favorite films, In Double Indemnity, the fairly rare movie we chose to watch again after we reviewed it for the original Top 100 Project list. Barbara Stanwyck is dynamite, Fred McMurray is pretty good as her dupe, and Edward G. Robinson gets to play something different and more interesting than he usually had, or would again. But Going My Way, a movie about a Catholic priest having to win over another Catholic priest, or something, who cares, got the glory that Double Indemnity should have had, and that galls me. Now, I think one of our longtime listeners, Eve, is not going to like me because I just turned up my nose at an Irish movie in Going My Way, and now I'm going to do it again in the number 2 slot. The one that should have won in 1941 was controversial for daring to shit on a dishonest media mogul, but talk about relevant now. Citizen Kane has been acknowledged as the greatest movie of all time by many people since 1941, including, of course, the AFI lists, both of them, and the Sight and Sound for decades. For the story, the production values, the acting, the subtext. Yet because people were afraid of the truth, and the Academy just loved giving John Ford Oscars, How Green Was My Valley won. I have seen that more than once, and it's fine. It's just no Citizen Kane. If you follow this channel, you know your movies, and you don't need to be told why this was an oversight then, and it feels like a ridiculous snub now. So thoughts on those last two? Double Indemnity and Kane?
I've never seen Going My Way, but I don't have to. Double Indemnity is my favorite Billy Wilder film, and maybe tied with Chinatown for my favorite noir. It's just so wonderful. There's no way that Going My Way deserved Best Picture over that. And come on, who am I to dispute Citizen Kane being a better movie than How Green Is My Valley? I had to watch How Green Is My Valley, just had to know. It's fine. Mm-hmm. It's a good movie. It is far from John Ford's best. And it certainly is not better than Citizen Kane. Another example of the Academy never being ahead of the curve.
He maybe won because the year before he won Best Director, but the movie didn't win Best Picture. That was Grapes of Wrath and Rebecca. Rebecca's a good movie. The only time Hitchcock ever won Best Picture. My number 1 biggest snub, and the worst choice for Best Picture compared to something I like better, so these have to be nominated, like we said before, was in 1989 when all of Driving Miss Daisy's competitors lost to that quietly racist little pile of puke. It's a pile of puke, Bev. Like Little Debbie. One of my favorite movies ever, Field of Dreams, was up against it. So was Born on the 4th of July. For all of its flaws, I'm still a pretty big fan of Dead Poets Society. Even My Left Foot, hey, I can redeem myself with Eve and our Irish fans by saying this, was far better than Driving Miss Daisy, which was the Green Book of its day. a pleasing, fairly modest car movie where a racist fuck realizes, hey, I've gotten to know a black person and I finally see that he's pretty awesome. So if I'm kind to him, that absolves me of ever being called a bigot again, right? Wait, I never thought of myself as a bigot anyway. I have a black friend. Okay, if movies like this and Green Book can do anything to convince racists to stop looking at the other as an alien to be hated and feared, then good job, I guess. But these aren't even very good movies, Driving Miss Daisy and Green Book, let alone better than Field of Dreams, or Born on the 4th of July, or some of Green Book's competitors like The Favorite or A Star is Born. Hell, another Morgan Freeman movie in 1989 about racism, Glory, was 10 times better than Driving Miss Daisy, and it wasn't even nominated. And when Denzel Washington won his Oscar for that movie, he even commented in a nice way by saying, I think it's at least one of the 5 best movies of the year. He's right. It should have been in there over most of those, actually, and certainly more than Driving Miss Daisy.
One of my pet peeves in cinema is movies made by white people that are about racism that aren't really supposed to illustrate racism so much as they're supposed to make white people feel better and feel like, well, if I was alive back then, I would never be that racist. Or to think somebody's a hero because after decades of living their life with a black person, they finally come around to the idea that they may not be inferior after all. Like us patting ourselves on the back for doing less than the bare minimum. These movies drive me fucking crazy. And the Academy loves them. I'm still mad about Green Book winning. That was some bullshit.
First time we ever did a post-view show, I think, Oscars post-view. I believe it started because we wanted to talk about Green Book winning. We thought that was bullshit. So that's it for the best pictures and some of the worst. Our podcast can not only brag about reaching 500 episodes as of today, and they're all absolutely free, but also our 10-year anniversary is coming up on March 25th. So get me some tin or some aluminium, Bev, and I shall get you some too. I love aluminium. If anyone wants to scroll all the way back to the beginning of this show on your favorite podcast service, you'll see that it looks like we debuted in August 2013, but that was just when we finally got on iTunes. We posted our intro podcast and then The Birth of a Nation in late March of 2013. That was only on our website at the time, so top100project.com, which is what we were called for 9 years, or almost, well, close to 10 years, which still seems to be active, by the way. I guess because we're paying for the domain name, which I just did again recently. In any case, we consider March 25th to be our We Have a Podcast date. So happy 10 years to us, and thanks to all the people who've been with us all this time, and less than 10 years worth of thanks to those who've only found us since. Although we love you too. We don't have a big audience, but they're loyal. In 4 days, it'll be time for another one of my solo shows. Since we're still in Oscar month, I'll be talking about the big winner of 1995, Braveheart. Mel Gibson is not a nice man, but he sure can direct a battle scene. In 7 days, we'll wrap up our 8th annual month of Oscars with a re-review of a Best Picture winner that we covered very briefly the night we saw it back in 2013. Now we'll do a proper full-length review of it, 12 Years a Slave. Funny to think that came before Green Book. It's almost like they went backwards after they finally had an advancement. We already did a full-length analysis of Inside Llewyn Davis back in January after posting a brief We Just Saw It review of that nearly 10 years ago. And later this year, we'll have a few more redos of what were then called the Now Playing Project podcasts. So the coming attractions trivia for next week's picture, 12 Years a Slave. There have been 15 occasions in the 21st century where a black person has been a producer of a Best Picture nominee, including Jordan Peele for 2 years in a row, and of course the angry pugilist Will Smith last year. Steve McQueen, who directed and produced 12 Years a Slave, is one of those 14 people. 14, not 15, because as I said, Jordan Peele did it twice in a row. McQueen is the only black person to ever win a Best Picture trophy. He was part of the 12 Years a Slave team with Brad Pitt and, I believe, Kleiner and Gardner. Who is the only black person to be even nominated as a producer for Best Picture from 1927, the first year they did the Oscars, to the year 2000. So for nearly 75 years of 20th century Oscars, one person, who was it?
All right, so for the answer to that question, check out next week's podcast, our 501st episode about 12 Years a Slave. You obviously already know how to find us. Let me remind you to favorite or subscribe wherever you listen. We're both on Twitter. I'm at Bev Ellis, and Ryan is at MovieThemed51. You can also reach us by email, haveyouvrseenpodcast@gmail.com. And we are posting bonus material on YouTube. Our YouTube channel is at HYES Ellis, and what we'd like to do is just give you like a 10-minute video of us talking about various movies we've seen or thoughts about the podcast that will follow.
Corrections,
etc., letters, and then the whole podcast for you to listen to on YouTube. And to enjoy freshly roasted premium coffee delivered straight to you in Canada or the US, please go to sparkplug.coffee/HYES and enjoy a 20% discount.
in honor of my number 8 best picture, The Apartment. Shut up and end the podcast.
And cut.